Good morning. It's so good to be in person. So my name is Abigail Archer, Abby, and I'm coordinator of the River Herring Network. If you turn your agenda over, you'll see the list of all the people who are on the steering committee. So we sort of meet informally in person back in the day, by conference call, and then just stay in email contact to figure out what kind of topics we should prepare for these meetings and what kind of speakers. So I just want to thank you to all of them for making this happen and being the brain trust. Let's see, thank you to the Middleborough Lakeville Herring and Fishery Commission for sponsoring the meeting and letting us use the library and doing all sorts of great organizational stuff.
Hi, good morning, welcome. On behalf of the town of Middleborough and Lakeville and the Middleborough Lakeville Herring Fishery Commission, it's good to see everybody again after a couple of years worth of hiatus here. Good that we can get together and come inside out of this British weather for a little while. Just a quick 5-minute introduction to the Nemasket River. I'm not going to bore you with the herring migration cycle because I think we're all pretty familiar with that. Just a little bit about us as a commission. We're a 7-member board appointed as fish wardens jointly by the selectmen of Middleborough and Lakeville. 5 wardens are Middleborough residents and 2 are residents of Lakeville. Wardens are the policy-making, voting members of the body, and we're in charge of policy and expenditures. We also have any number of volunteer observers who would like to help us, who have the same duties as wardens, but don't get to vote on the process. We have 3 broad mandates to administer and enforce herring catching regulations, public education about the herring run, and protection and improvement of herring habitat and the run in general. We also have a number of herring counters that help us along the line with our duties during the springtime. We are a town board, so we have to follow the open meeting laws and public records rules. The Nemasket River is part of the Narragansett Bay Taunton River Run, which is the largest and the longest run in the state. Our herring swim up the Taunton River through Narragansett Bay and enter the 11-mile-long Nemasket River. The headwaters of this river is the Allewwife Pond complex, the 5-pond complex, which comprise the largest natural great ponds in the state. 4 of the ponds comprise the water supply reservoir for Taunton and New Bedford, controlled by those cities. Most of the land around the ponds is controlled and owned by the cities of Taunton and New Bedford and the town of Lakeville, which makes for rather pristine spawning habitat and a fair amount of watershed protection. Luckily, we have a great working relationship with the city water departments. Our biggest challenges of late have been the excessive growth of invasive vegetation in the river. Milfoil and other invasives are steadily narrowing the river channel, and we fear it will significantly impair herring migration in the not too distant future. Luckily, the spring migration usually occurs before the growing season, but we do have serious concerns for the fry migrating down to the ocean. The 3 recent summer droughts, 2016, 2020, and again this year, have not helped us at all. A second challenge is the sedimentation below the Allewwife Dam caused by sand migrating through the dam from the lakes. We had a rather large sandbar just below the dam and also a sandbar from highway runoff at Route 495. Both of those caused some serious impediments in low water conditions. There is a plan to remove the sediment and install a sand trap below the dam, spearheaded by SERPED, the Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development District, and also with some funding spearheaded by Senator Rodericks and the state representative delegation. As you may have heard, we performed a test weed removal project on a 1/2 mile stretch of the river in August of last year. After obtaining the necessary permits, we were restricted to work on the first 2 weeks of August because of the spawning cycle of the red-bellied cooter, which is an endangered turtle, which seems to call the Nemasket its home. We utilized a machine called an eco-harvester, which pulled milfoil from the river by the roots. The test went well and there was noticeable flow improvement, but being a small patch, it filled in again rather quickly. Our hope is that the state or regional entity won't drop the ball and will become responsible for a larger project along the river. Our runs fluctuated in the last few years. Last year was a fairly low estimate, as were most runs around the area. We have been granted permission by the Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission with the invaluable help of Brad Chase and Mass Marine Fisheries to reopen our run to recreational catching. There would be a few logistical hurdles to put in place before that happens, not the least of which is some kind of a tagging system with the environmental police to show that the herring were caught legally, and also ramping up the manpower to ensure proper coverage during catching times. As someone in the back of the room said, looking for volunteers, and there will be a lot of volunteers necessary before that happens. We also do not want to be the only run open in the state that's open to catching. So a few more of you folks have to open up for a catching program. Thank you for coming today and enjoy the program.
This is Meghna Marjadi. She is a PhD student at UMass Amherst, and she's going to tell us about the project that she's been working on with a whole bunch of partners to try and monitor juvenile river herring. We could go to counting adults upstream, but there's lots of challenges about counting little guys and girls going downstream. So.
Thanks so much for having me again. I'm excited to share some updated results of this project I presented on a few years ago. So we're using video monitoring to assess juvenile river herring immigration. And so we all know the river herring life cycle, but just to get it started, they live in the ocean, come to freshwater to spawn, leave the ocean as babies at some point between June and November in response to certain environmental triggers that we aren't totally sure about. So I'm focusing on how we can predict when the juveniles migrate to the ocean, and also how we can use this video technology to better assess abundances of juveniles as they leave freshwater to go to the ocean. So thinking about what environmental and biological factors play a role in juvenile success and emigration timing, some of the things that have been proposed are seasonality, so photo period, changes in the amount of daylight of each day, moon cycles, weather conditions, including precipitation, flow rates, cloud cover, and availability of food, specifically zooplankton. So some of the ones that have been identified are the new moon. So there's been some relationships between juveniles migrating during the new moon, rapid decreases in water temperature, increases in stream discharge, rainfall in some cases, lower water visibility, lower zooplankton density, but only in a few sites and only one specific species. And then also some conditions of the juveniles themselves. Yes?
Can you speak into the microphone?
Oh, is it not?
And the other one.
Oh, is it this one?
Yes.
Oh, so this is just, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought I was speaking. Some of the differences in growth rates between migrating juveniles who might be smaller at different ages. But all of these studies have been conducted over short periods of time, so not necessarily the whole juvenile migration period, June to November, and also in different sites. So it's hard to understand what the actual triggers are, and additionally, some of them have been inconsistent between sites. So we set out to figure out how some of these environmental triggers were related to immigration, and not considering the growth rates and the biological triggers at this time. And so in order to do this, I worked with John Shepard, Division of Marine Fisheries, and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, Joel Yovis there, to install a camera at the Herring Run Motel in Bourne, Massachusetts, at the outlet of Great Herring Pond, between the, the motel is here, and it's right at the outlet of the Herring, it's at the Herring Run Motel, which is a motel right at the canal, And it's a place where the river constricts through a swimming pool. It's actually rather strange. And that allows us to put this camera there. So it's a very unique system. All the juveniles have to go through this constriction. So it allows us to install this camera to capture all of them as they go through. So we installed this camera between June and November in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And the footage looks something like this. It's not terribly clear, but you still can see the river herring traveling by. We also see that some of them go back, and some of them take different amounts of time to go through. So processing this video became quite a challenge, especially since we had each of these dots represents a video taken between June and November. We had over 500 per year. So it's a lot of data. How are we actually going to count all of this? So we worked with a computer scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Her name is Sydney, and also with Ryan Gaboses, and to create a neural network to assess the videos. So a neural network functions kind of the same way that Google does. So you train, it's based on connections in the brain. You train the network with certain images, beach ball, dog, sailboat, something like that, on thousands of those images. And then it learns how to recognize those over time. And so we tried to do the same thing with fish. We ended up working on that and teaching the network to assess whether certain images were fish or not fish, what blob size they were, if certain blobs were fish and blobs were not fish, stuff like that. And we also assessed the contrast levels and used those aspects of the images to assess what was a fish and what wasn't a fish. And we worked on a bunch of different types of neural networks to figure out which one was going to work best. So the cycle of our processing was to collect this video footage, do some manual video processing to have reference images, and also to count how fish were passing through the video. So we didn't want to double count fish, so we also assessed how long they took to pass through the video. We developed an algorithm, and then what I talked about last time I was here was we used this citizen science platform called Zooniverse to ask, maybe some of you participated in this, we asked folks to help us count video frames and put boxes around fish or identify whether or not there was a fish in the image. And that helped us validate the algorithm to see whether or not it was working well. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of algorithm development and validation today because I've talked about that before with all of you. So I'll tell you how well it works and then talk about some of the data we actually have from processing the results. We did have over 3,000 volunteers participate in this project to process over 100,000 images. So the different algorithms that we used were YOLO 1 and YOLO 2, which are based on some nerdy computer scientists who changed "you only live once" to "you only look once." The idea is that you're only supposed to have to go through images once instead of pre-processing them. IV3 and RE101, I actually do not know what they stand for, but they are different types of classification algorithms that have been used for similar processes with plankton identification. And so here we have the frames that we identified. So we tested 19,498 frames across different conditions, weather conditions, water conditions, and different months to make sure that the algorithm functions similarly across months. And we have the false negatives. So that's when the algorithm identified that there was no fish, but there was one. The false positives, the algorithm identified that there was a fish, but there wasn't one. And then the true negatives and true positives where the algorithm was right. And then we use these metrics that are the standard computational metrics for assessing accuracy. So the precision, the recall, and the F1 score. The F1 score assesses for how well the algorithm categorizes true negatives and true positives across the whole suite of images that have been tested. And so the highest F1 score was 0.85, so it's between 0 and 1. So it has about an 85% accuracy here, which is actually quite similar to our citizen science accuracy, which was at 88%. And also, our within expert agreement was 0.92. So even when we tested within experts counting the fish, because the images are so unclear and difficult, the agreement was only 0.92. So we felt that it was pretty accurate with presence absence of when there's a fish and when there isn't. So we ended up using the top YOLO model. We also considered count metrics. So we tested an expert numerical count of 189 images over 3,000 fish to the algorithm count, and they were highly correlated with a correlation of about 0.95. So we can use that to model some error bars around our numbers for the counting metrics. So we're pretty happy with how this has produced some results. The agreement between experts and experts in the algorithm has been pretty clear. So once we applied it, we processed our videos using the Hui computational resources. And that took about 6 weeks because we had so many videos with it running 24/7. So putting this into practice with other systems is hopefully something that's possible, but does require access to some supercomputing. And we got this graph. So this shows the day of the year on the x-axis and the number of juveniles detected on the y-axis. And keep in mind, these haven't been transformed or edited with error bars. This is just the numbers that the algorithm spit out for how many fish detected. And this is for the year 2017. I only included 1 year today. And we do see that the migration starts on June 8th, which is about what we predicted, and seems to end around November 1st. And additionally, there's also been evidence of bimodal peaks in juvenile immigration. We do see those here. One peak in July and one peak in September. So it's pretty consistent with some of the things we've thought before about juvenile immigration. We do see these drops over here. It never quite hits 0, and that might be because of the ability of the algorithm to actually detect 0, so it gets stuck on leaves and little flecks of light sometimes, but the relative difference between these peaks is really high. So I also considered some of these basic environmental conditions in relation to the number of juveniles detected. And so found that more juveniles may be emigrating on clear days. So again, just the numbers, no statistics, but what we see is with clear days, we see more juveniles migrating, more juveniles detected by the algorithm compared to mostly cloudy, overcast, and partly cloudy days. And we did test the algorithm again across the different conditions and found very little difference in accuracy for the algorithm across conditions. So we do know that there's not algorithm performance issue there. We also found that more juveniles may emigrate on the full or new moon. So this is an agreement with the Yako et al. Paper from before where they'd seen more juveniles traveling on the new moon, but we also found more juveniles might be traveling on the full moon. So that's an interesting thing to consider with tidal cycles. We also found, and this one is really interesting to me because a lot of the work conducted before was not even conducted at night, that a lot of juveniles, maybe most of them, were traveling at night. So that tells us that we may not have the full picture of what the emigration patterns are since monitoring at night was not conducted before because it's hard who's standing out there at night with a net counting fish. So this gives us the ability to count fish at night. And we also do know that the algorithm functioned very well at night. So the worst times for algorithm functioning were afternoon and late afternoon. And that was also related to the fact that it found fewer fish in general in afternoon and late afternoon. So it was harder for it to distinguish. And we also found that juveniles preferred to migrate on days with no rain, or May. We haven't done stats yet. So there's the most fish were found on days, so this is inches of precipitation per hour and on that day, and the number of juveniles detected. And the days with 0 inches of precipitation have the most juveniles detected. So they may be migrating after rain, a few days after rain, if there is a relationship between precipitation, but it seems like the days where there is rain are not migrating. So these are very preliminary analyses. We're seeing that more juveniles emigrate on clear days, during the night with no precipitation, and during full and new moon cycles. It's consistent with some previous studies, but we're finding some new things, especially with night migration and the relationship to precipitation. So our next steps are to consider some statistical analysis with water temperature, precipitation on previous days, photo period, presence of zooplankton and other proposed triggers, and then explore some models to better understand peak emigration dates. We'll also be considering more years of data and working with the error bars around the counting to see if there is a way to estimate abundance better. And so I'd like to thank our collaborators. We've had a bunch of people working on this project and our funders for this project as well.
Next up is Brad Chase, who needs no introduction. So he's our one of a few Diadromous Fisheries biologists at the state, and he's going to give us an update on what's been happening in the past year, or a couple of years, because we haven't got together.
So I'm going to give an update on issues in coastal Massachusetts with diadromous fish from my perspective as a old school, stuck in the mud, leaky waiter fish biologist who works at the State Division of Fisheries. And I'm going to start with two slides that are somewhat of an outline for what I'm going to talk about. The first one is on what I think are highlights in the region for diadromous fish. There's been an awful lot of large watershed projects that are underway. A lot of federal money is out there right now, so I want to touch on some of these. The DMF Fishway crew was very quiet in 2001. This year we've come back with 6 projects, so I want to touch on those. And we've gotten a little active for the same reason with herring stocking. The pandemic slowed us down a little bit. This year we got out and we moved fish to 5 places. And then also we started a new stocking program for American shad in the Taunton River with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Division of Fish and Wildlife. And I want to talk about that. We've already put out 5 million shad in the first year of this project.
American shad?
American shad, yep. And so also want to touch on some management activities. There's a lot going on in the past year or two. We have a new stream maintenance policy. Stream maintenance was really kind of in limbo with the Wetlands Protection Act on how you interact with this type of work. There were exemptions given for agriculture, mosquito control, transportation, but fish pasture was kind of silent on this activity. So we have a new policy we work with the Department of Environmental Protection on how to do this work, also how to do work with small fishways. That was released in April this year. We have a new diadromous fish GIS data layer that has all sites in coastal Massachusetts where fish encounter obstructions, fishways, dams, and that's going to be published very soon as a mass GIS data layer. I'll touch on that. We started doing a new survey. The last coastal fish run survey was done 20 years ago, and we're updating that now. And then also, we heard Dave talk about harvest. That harvest is done under a sustainable fishery management plan managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. We have one plan that's under review right now. It's an update for the Nemasket River. And we have a new plan for Herring River and Harwich. I want to talk about that briefly. Okay, so it's kind of funny to be here with a live audience. I guess if people have any burning questions or if I missed something, go ahead and ask. I think we have time. So I'm going to touch on these large watershed projects. These are places where you've got multiple sites in a watershed where you have a couple dams. There's often a large spawning nursery habitat upstream where fish can't reach that. So there's multiple sites that need work. These are often 10-year projects, maybe 20-year projects in Wellfleet's example. These are 3 that I've worked on quite a bit with lots of partners. Jones River in Kingston I'm going to touch on later. Fort River Braintree is kind of in limbo right now. That project was going to go to construction this year to take out a large dam and build a nature-like fishway in Braintree, but the permits were challenged. The water quality certificate was challenged, and right now we're in the middle of like a year-long challenge for that permit, so that's frustrating. West Fort River DMF funded a feasibility study for a new fishway at Forge Pond Dam in Westport. We're looking at a fishway at the upstream dam at Lake Nokichoke. And so the next step there is to try to find funding for final design and permitting for this site where fish cannot get above that dam or the dam above it, and above that is 170 acres of spawning nursery habitat. So big rewards, big efforts. There's so much going on right now in Massachusetts, you could give a presentation on this slide alone. And I apologize if I missed your projects. I tried to get the ones I think that are getting close or very active. There's 10 on that list. There could be a lot more. It's really remarkable how much is going on right now with federal funding from the NOAA Restoration Center, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Natural Resource and Conservation Service. We heard about Wellfleet. They hit the restoration jackpot. You have your money now, so you're all set. Cape Cod NRCS, they're doing a lot of work on several individual sites. That's really active. Talbot Mills, the Concord River, we heard about the Merrimack River. This is a tributary, really important historical site to move a dam. That's a big project. We have the Bridgewater as represented here, 3 sites in Bridgewater, East and West, so really excited to see that. Again, you could spend a lot of time talking about these sites, and I'll just touch on a couple going forward. So first, looks like I lost some color in this map. Yeah, okay, that's all right. So this is a good example of several locations in a large watershed where you have a large target in terms of spawning and nursery habitat, the 640-acre Silver Lake. This map is from 2011. It's also a good example of our GIS data layer, which shows some of the features where fish passage is, fish are able to go places are in green, where they cannot go, it's in red. Every location where there's an impediment has information. The green circles means they can pass, yellow circles means there's a project that needs to be done, red circles mean they cannot pass. And there's underlying data on every site, recommendations on what they should do. The data layer also has the different sites where people monitor river herring, smelt, and eel. So 2011, the Walking Road Dam did not let fish pass. The Jonesboro Watershed Association got busy with the Division of Ecological Restoration, and it was a really important coastal dam removal. Move forward, the Elm Street Dam came out in 2019, and then a fishway was installed at the Forge Pond Dam in 2019, and fish had access to Silver Lake for the first time in well over 100 years. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this watershed, but it's a good example of looking at multiple sites and taking your time and working through the different systems to try to make things happen. The next steps, up at Forge Pond Dam, there's that wood ladder that went in 2019. It's a temporary structure. So we can now get fish into Silver Lake, which is good. It's hard getting them out. This is this water supply for the city of Brockton, and they like their water, and so it's hard to get fish out of here. So we're looking to dredge the pond. It's really weedy. It's one of those dying mill ponds, and so either you take the dam out or you have to do something about the pond. So we're seeking to get it permitted to be dredged. We're also looking to put in a permanent fish ladder there. And so DMF holds a contract right now, funding from the Jonesboro Watershed Association, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We've got Gomez and Sullivan contract to design a new fishway, design and permitting, and hopefully next summer we can make all this happen. So very exciting project. Also at this site, there's a graduate student from UMass Dartmouth, and she's got 4 fight nets at different locations, looking at the out-migration of silver eels, which leave in the fall. Question from Ryan?
Once you open up the site, how do you introduce, train the fish to come back up since it's been closed off for some time?
Oh, they're there?
They're there. The reason I think this was targeted, because it was a historic fish line, but there were also river herring using downstream tributaries in smaller ponds, so we knew they were there. There were 2 dams in the way. In 2018, so when the Wapping Road Dam came out in 2011, the fish could move upstream then. We didn't see them until 2018, I think, below this dam. It took them a while to find out, but once we saw them, it was okay, let's work with Brockton to get a fish ladder. And that's how it went. So in some cases, we will stock fish if there's no fish in the system. Here they were there, so we didn't want to stop. We wanted to keep this group of fish moving upstream. So this project is interesting because it's targeting silver eels, yet flow can't be released here in an average year until October, November. And so the nets went in and we caught all these large river herring, both adults that were trapped in Silver Lake and these really large juveniles, young of the year, shown in that photograph. So really cool site, interesting data coming out on silver eels as well as the fish leaving the system that came up in the spring.
Brad, some of those fish come from the other system of Furnace Pond in Pembroke.
It's complicated, I left that one out. They can actually come from the North River to Herring Brook through a water diversion by the city of Brockton. And In the future, they might come from the Taunton River side. I'll mention that in a minute. So it gets very complicated. And here's what I'm saying. So there's Silver Lake to the right, and you can see it's green because they're now coming from the Jones River. So this is one of those big conceptual projects that no one thought possible, to bring herring from Setauket River in the Taunton River system further upstream. Once the Cotton Juvenile Dam came out in 2017, it gave fish a chance to move into Robbins Pond. 124 acre, nice spawning and nursery habitat. And then the question is, can we move them further up? So we have a project underway right now to bring them up from what's called Stumpbrook Bog Reservoir. There's an impassable dam there. We're going to put a fishway on it. It would give them access to 168 acres, and then they could move on to the Monpont Ponds, which is over 500 acres. To me, these two sites, Silver Lake and this complex, are really the largest restoration targets in Massachusetts, certainly for coastal Massachusetts in terms of potential spawning and nursery habitat, where fish could not access. So that's why a lot of folks are interested, and we're moving ahead on this project. I presented the project last night to the Conservation Commission in East Bridgewater. It was continued. I wanted to have a nice animation or some geeky thing to show you that it was approved last night, but it wasn't. They continued it, but we're moving ahead. And so it began with a DMF survey and design at the dam right there. And then we developed this design. We got a grant from the Taunton River Stewardship Council to contract GCA to do a final design and permitting. And that's what we're trying to permit right now. DMF will fund, it's basically an aluminum attachment, the fishway, to the dam. And DMF will fund the materials. We'll fabricate the fishway on the Bedford shop this winter and hopefully install it this summer. And then fish will have access to the reservoir. Okay, another one. This one is done. Mill River Watershed Restoration in the Taunton River system. This is the Mill River, which runs right through downtown Taunton. And this slide goes back to 2011 when you can see a lot of red. There were four impassable dams where fish could not go. And there was a lot of spawning acreage upstream with Lake Sebatia and Winnicott Pond. And so the Division of Ecological Restoration was very active with this one, as well as other partners. That's the Lake Sebatia Dam that was reconstructed by the Department of Conservation and Recreation to keep the pond level up. And so a fishway was placed there, and the 3 dams below were removed. And then you can see a lot of green, and all of a sudden fish have access to over 400 acres of spawning nursery habitat. So one of the better examples, I think, of a watershed-wide restoration approach. 3 dam removals, so really a big successful project. Right now we're monitoring at Lake Sebatia. We have an eel ramp, we have a video system for herring, and we're tracking response. This graph shows the river herring spring spawning run counts at Lake Sebatia. We loved that graph until this year, because it just kept going up. We thought it just keep going forever.
Just gonna pretend this year didn't happen.
Yeah, I almost cut that out. But, we wanted, 2022 was a difficult year for most systems, and this is kind of what we saw in many systems. We stepped down, and that happened as well as Sebatia. But we'll keep monitoring there as well as having meal count. A very good example of a watershed restoration project that was completed. So let me move on now to the smaller projects the DMF Fishway crew does. And so again, we had a quiet year in 2021, and we got busy this year. These 3 projects are single-day projects in the field working with towns to make them happen. Red Brook and Bourne working with the town of Bourne to basically kind of rehab that fish ladder. Hydraulic cement was put in place, repaired a weir. Just a lot of work done to try to clean it up, tune it up. As part of an effort to look at Red Brook and see what we can do to improve things. Indian Head River Dam, Pembroke and Hanover. A 1 day to install 13 baffles and to fix a few stop log slots, quite a few days in the shop to fabricate that wood. And so that was done. And then the Weldon Rubble Dam was a case where there was an old mill dam in the Acushnet River that under low flows in drought years, the water goes through the dam. It doesn't go over the dam. And so any juveniles going downstream are just going to get impinged in this old rubble weir. And I had been to the site. John Shepard brought me out to it, and I said, okay, we're going to take care of this. And we went out a couple weeks later with our crew. We got the whole crew out there, and we worked really hard, and we removed a lot of the stones and just made a pathway through that rubble dam. So these are 3 small projects, but they're good to get them done. Here's one a little bit larger at the Monument River at the Cape Cod Canal. The Army Corps of Engineers asked us to come down. This is their fishway. And it was one of the important entranceways to the fishway. It was just in complete disrepair. And so this was about a week-long project. And it was interesting because it had some features, I think, that was somewhat different and special. That weir construction took some really special carpentry work by Ed Clark. The floor was completely irregular, and so he had to scribe the wood form to support the concrete pouring in a way that I couldn't even imagine, but he did it with a full sheet of plywood scribing the floor. And then water control was really difficult because you've seen Great Herring Pond, Little Herring Pond, over 400 acres upstream. It's hard to contain that flow. So we put boards at upstream dams, and then we had one pump put in. It didn't work, so we put a second pump in. There's Jimmy Rosenall working on that. Where's Jimmy? He's here today. Yep, Jimmy's with our fishway crew. And so, difficult water control, difficult form construction, and in the end, 1 week later, we had a nice new weir there. The Army Corps paid for it, and they worked alongside of us. Very good cooperative job. Okay, another week-long job was the Black Pond Fishway, Long Pond in Harwich. This is the Herring River system. And here the town came to us, and they identified a failing fishway that connected the 2 ponds. And this one's interesting because it's near the border of both the town of Brewsters and Harwich, so we were working with staff for both towns. And we decided to not bring our excavator in because of the sensitive property issues, so we hand dug the 65-foot length. A lot of digging there. Ryan Birch was there with the town of Brewster, and one afternoon I left and Ryan was still digging. I came back in the morning and he was there digging. So I just assumed but a lot of digging. We had to spread the walls. That's our old ancient bugle jack, which I love right there. There's Caitlin and Stephanie with our crew, both working impact drives at the same time. I love that. And then it was just, installing about a third of it was brand new fishway. The rest of it we just rehabbed. And it was a good cooperative project. The town of Harwich paid for the materials, and I think it came in at about $1,600 for this project.
Oh my God, not bad.
The core project was similar, about $1,500, I think. Somewhere around there. John was there, he worked this in the core project, so a little bit of ibuprofen after that one. Okay, moving on to herring stocking. So we had 5 sites this year. In most of these cases are where we opened up access to a place where herring couldn't get to. We have a policy for stocking where we only take genetic fish from similar genetic stocks, and then we like to, not put fish with our fish present already. So we want to let them colonize and come back on their own. If that's not the case, we will bring fish from a nearby stock. And these are the ones. Down below is Carl Von Home. He told me on his bucket list before he retired this summer, he wanted to stock fish in Little Sandy Pond. And so we got him a lot of fish before Carl wrapped it up this season. So, and then the Taunton River shad stocking, I think, has been discussed for a very long time. I think it came together nicely this year. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has stopped stocking Atlantic salmon using their Attleboro hatchery. And so they want to look for other species, so they're interested in shad. And so we got together with the Division of Fish and Wildlife, us and them. They're raising the fish and stocking them, and then we're monitoring the sites with the Division of Fish and Wildlife. And in the first year, over 5 million shad larvae went out, and it was exciting to see that. There are some shad in the Taunton River. It's an interesting story where that population just faded away well over 100 years ago. The thought is that maybe industrial pollution was part of that. There were not a lot of dams in the Taunton River, but there was a lot of industry. And so they really faded away.
Do you think the shad are going to stay in the Taunton itself, or do you expect them to migrate into the other streams?
Historically, there were shad fisheries that were really important in some of the tributaries, the Town River, Setauket River. I'm not certain about the Nemasket, but they were present in these tributaries, so they could go up the Setauket, heading up that system as well. We think it's a great target because there are no main stem dams to hold shad up, and we think that shad do not do a great job of colonizing like river herring do, and so maybe they just need a boost with stocking. And so We put them out there, it's gonna be a multi-year program. That young fellow caught that fish a few years ago, so there was still some shad in the system, but very few. So we did some monitoring for 5 years pre-stocking, both electrofishing and beach seining. We caught a few juveniles and a couple adult shad with the electrofishing. We caught none in 5 years of beach seining. So the stocking occurred this year. We caught juveniles right away in June and July, that left photograph on the bottom. And then Thursday, Stephanie was out, and they caught some corkers, some really big 14-centimeter juvenile shad in the system. So we're saving genetic samples. I have to imagine these are our fish, but we're going to confirm that we have a genetic footprint of the fish that we stock, and so we'll match that up. And that's going to go forward. So we hope to develop a small fishway. We have to develop a river herring habitat plan that's approved by Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. We drafted that with the other agencies, and I'm going to present that on Thursday to the Technical Committee of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission for river herring for their approval. Okay, on the stream channel maintenance. So this is a really age-old practice that has gone on for forever. Towns have just handled this. They've recognized that we have to do things to remove natural debris, jams, tree falls, things like that can impede these fish, mainly on their way out in the fall, summer and fall. And again, I mentioned earlier how it wasn't well supported by the Wetlands Protection Act. And we think it's becoming a growing less water flow in some of our systems. Many towns do a great job with this. Other towns have just kind of forgotten about the need to do this. And we're seeing some rivers just getting choked off with multiple year tree falls, invasive plant growth, native plant growth. And to me, it's a growing problem. We developed guidelines on how to do this responsibly in 2016. That's available on our website. And then this year, working with DP for several years, we put out a policy that connects this practice to the Wetlands Protection Act. It allows it to happen with DMF working with the towns. It also allows small fishway work to happen easily without extensive planning. So to us, that was a nice win, and we're working with towns. And you would love to not have to do this, but again and again, I see problems. The upper photograph is a place down the Cape where we had a fish kill of juveniles caught in a leaf jam. Oakleys fall every year, and the water was 2 to 3 inches deep, and the fish were impinged in the leaves. And so something as simple as that. Another site in the Cape where you had to release fish from this creek by digging out a channel, 1 or 2 people working on a shovel. So these things, they have to be done in our present day of having just low flow. The 10-year droughts are showing up more frequently, and we just have to manage these things. And if that's not enough problem, what I'm seeing is more and more native invasive plant encroachment at sites where we have reduced flow. And so you're seeing these plants, many times they're native, like swamp loosestrife and Herring River and Harwich. This plant loves coming into channels where you have reduced flow. It will eventually just re-engineer the channel to be a wetland. And I'm seeing it with water willow, that's up Ware River and Hingham. In places there in the upper watershed, there's no real defined channel anymore. It's just kind of a diffuse wetland where this water willow has just broken up the flow. And then the invasive Phragmites we see in a lot of places where it just gets thicker and thicker, and eventually it'll impede any passage of fish. So it's just I think in our present day of having less water available in the summer and fall, that we're just seeing this problem growing. And so I commend the towns that are on top of this. Quite a few Cape towns do a great job, and I encourage other towns to work with us to try to come up with plans for their rivers. Okay, let me move on to the DMF Diadromous Fish Restoration Priority List and GIS data layer. So this is a data layer that has over 475 sites where there's a fishway, a dam, some junction that impedes fish, and it includes recommendations and evaluations for every site on what should be done. And so the priority list, which began from our last survey 20 years ago as an Excel spreadsheet, is now integrated with this GIS data layer. It's used by MassDEP. They use our fish passage valuation for valuing watersheds as impaired for fish passage. That was a nice win when that happened. It's also used by MassDOT to help their infrastructure planning for transportation work. So we think it's a useful tool. It's one tool. And it's taken a very long time to get this published, but it's supposed to be published in the next month with MassGIS, and then anybody can use it. And we'll be sending out links. We'll probably have training sessions. I know we'll have a training session at the MACC meeting next spring. And so we hope to train people on how to use this. And we're pretty excited about this tool in the restoration community. And again, we're going to publish it, I'm told, very, very soon. Okay, the Fish Passage Survey. So this was the last one done over 20 years ago. It looked at all the sites. It was focused on river herring and fishways. We're expanding it to look at more species, more types of structures, and really to account for so many changes in the last 20 years because the restoration community has just done so much work. So it's really remarkable how much in that document 20 years ago has changed. So we started the survey in 21. We're moving along slowly. It's going to take a while to cover the whole coast, and then take even longer to write it up because that's the way things go. And but we hope it will be a good tool, and it'll be fully integrated with the GIS data layer, so that these things can be updated seamlessly, hopefully in the future. That was our training session at the Herringbrook Park in Pembroke, and we've been out since, and we're going to get back doing this, I think, as the winter goes on. Once again, fully integrated with the DMF, Diadromous Fish GIS data layer, and the restoration priority list. And we've done most of the Cape and Southeast Mass, and we'll be chipping away this winter at other locations. Okay, so diadromous fish monitoring, we all do a lot of that. DMF tends to focus on these 4 species, and I think a lot of folks here focus on river herring. So I want to touch on this a little. This graphic here shows, yeah, I've lost color. It's interesting. Most of a lot of these slides, a lot of the maps have lost color. But what you see there is all the sites, or most of the sites where the counting occurs. There's 40 sites now. The red brackets are coastal drainage areas where we wanted to have at least one so-called high-tech counting site, meaning video or electronic counting at these coastal drainage areas. We also wanted to have biological sampling at least one of these sites in each of these areas. We achieved that a few years ago. A lot of these sites have volunteer visual counts, 14 the so-called high-tech census counts, and 8 stations have biological sampling. Here is the handout that John Shepard prepared. I think you folks have seen. It has all the sites from 2022, and there are 40 of them. You know, this field season, to me, there's a lot of doom and gloom over what happened because we just saw low runs everywhere. And looking at this site, though, I can pick out 5 or 6 sites that showed some improvement, and they kind of bucked the trend of downward movement the last 2 years. So it wasn't uniform. There was a couple of sites that had decent improvements. And so hopefully we can see something turn back because we have gone down since 2019. Here's a graph that combines 4 of the sites where we have 20 years of data. The Nemasket River, Mattapoisett River, Monument River, and Back River. Many of you have seen this from me before. It shows the harvest ban in 2005 and how we had modest improvements after that. And then we had that down year in 2017 when the fish backed out of the Nemasket River and didn't come back. So we don't know if they spawned elsewhere in the Taunton River watershed, but they certainly stopped coming up that year and resulted in a low year. Then we had some high years. 2019 was uniformly very good at most sites. And since then, we've stepped down. It's kind of discouraging. You would think the recruitment from 2019 would have made this year a good year, given 3-year-olds coming back. It didn't happen. So that whole recruitment connection between juveniles and adults is very much something for us to think about and talk about. If you take, here's a stack bar graph, the same data just shows you the different sites. The Nemasket River in blue, Back River in Weymouth is in red, fairly stable. You know, that site is not experiencing quite the downturns, the up and downs of these other sites. You could say the same for the Monument River in green. And the Nemasket River has those 2 years, 2022 and 17, that really went down and drove this whole qualitative index down. The poor Mattapoisett River in yellow there on the bottom, just historically a very big run, big harvest, large spawning area, and yet that run is just down at the lowest possible level with little response in recent years. So that one's very concerning for us. we think it might be impacted by this whole low flow, difficult emigration for juvenile situation we see in many places. Okay, here's a couple runs that have lots of work done recently for restoration. The red is the Mystic River, blue is Pembroke, Herringbrook, and the green is Tombrook and Plymouth. And again, here's a graph where we used to say, wow, look at that graph, it's going up every year, and then all of a sudden, 2020, it went down for the Mystic and Pembroke badly. Pembroke has really crashed almost, and that's very concerning because that run had reached 400,000 after being below 100,000. The Mystic, it's not as bad as it looks because it still had over 400,000 fish this year. It was the top run among counted stations in Massachusetts, so congratulations, Mystic River. We get excited over those categories. And Tombrook's interesting because a lot of restoration work has been done. The numbers have been fairly stable, maybe some resiliency to downturns in that system because of all the work that's been done, but you're not seeing that post-2019 downturn. You're seeing it fairly stable. So it's something interesting to be found there as well. A little more on the Mystic, just because I think it's one of those great examples of watershed-wide approaches. There was no passage into the upper lake of Mystic Lakes in 2011 until DCR rebuilt the dam and put a fishway in. And so that happened in 2012. The fishway included an eel ramp and a downstream migration channel for juveniles. And it gave hope to look upstream to more passage opportunities. And here we are in the present day, and you can see a fishway went in up at Central Falls in Winchester 2016, and some work was done up at Horn Pond in 2018. And so this system's gained 287 acres of spawning and nursery habitat. A great example, and I think we're seeing these big numbers coming out of the Mystic, maybe in part from this. And so maybe some resiliency here that we don't see in other systems. Again, the top count for 2 years, for many years it was the Nemasket River was the top count in Massachusetts, really for decades. And very recently we've seen Harwich and the Mystic River system have that top count. And I think for Harwich and Mystic it might be a reflection on some restoration activities. Okay, on to river herring harvest plans. So again, we have a new game in town where the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission requires towns and states to work together to prepare sustainable fishery management plans. Everything was closed in 2005. The Nemasket River wanted to open, so we prepared a plan. It took 3 years to get approved. Their plan is now up for renewal this year. They elected not to open. They didn't want to be the only one. I can understand that. So their plan is going to be reviewed. And then we have a new plan for Herring River Harwich, which is under review as well. And there's the Herring River Watershed. I'll be going before the Herring River Technical Committee on Thursday as well, with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, to present these plans and then to seek their approval. Then it moves on to the management board, and they'll vote in November on whether they approve these plans or not. Then it comes back to the town. It's up to the towns whether they want to open or not with that approval. Here's the Nemasket River spawning run count. It's a visual count, and you can see some tremendous fluctuations. That big spike was over 1 million fish, and then we had the drought of 2000, 2001 times.
Just because you left out that subject about those harvest plans, the towns are considering that. Really, it takes time. So it does get done, but if you're thinking about that, the edits, the data, the reviews, the back and forth, the communication, Brad is unbelievably awesome in putting stuff like this together. He's done it before, so he can help you through these kind of loops. But working with your selectmen, if there's a change within a year, within your first selectman, you have to start over. Eventually goes to the public. It's a big ordeal, a big undertaking. So if you're considering it, there's no harm in beginning that process. It'll take longer than you first think, but you hopefully get to a point where you have that option. So I just want to say that it's towns are considering it. It does take time, but there's no problem in starting.
There's a lot. You have public meetings with the Board of Selectmen. There's a lot of steps you need to go through to reopen a herring run. And so I applaud the towns for wanting to. They may not open, but they just want to have that approval so that they can choose to. And if they have another year like a million fish year, then why would you not want to give the public access to some of those fish? So back to the Nemasket River counts. Basically, this one here is here's the time series mean, first quartile, and then here's the spawning run metric of what can be harvested. It's 10% of the time series mean. If the run drops below the 25th percentile of the time series count 2 years in a row, then you cut the harvest in half to 5%. If it goes down below that number 3 years in a row, then the harvest has to cease. So that's what the plan does. It puts in hooks on how things go forward. You can see we've had 2 years below the 25th percentile. It was that 2017 year where I feel the fish backed out of the river and they didn't disappear, they went someplace else. This number probably could be a little bit higher. This year, we're all concerned about 2022 because we had lower counts in many systems. So that's the basis. It's very simple. It's a metric based on the spawning run counts. Many of you are involved with spawning run counts, and so this data can serve this purpose. It can serve to support stock assessments. It can serve to support this type of management process. For Harwich, the data series, it only goes back with electronic count of 7 years, but there's a volunteer visual count that goes back 11 years more. So here's the data there, and you can see same approach, a 10% of the time series mean, but that mean is really propped up by these 3 big years where it was the top run in the state. It's come down like many runs after 2019. But again, the request came in, so we're working with the town, and we want to come up with a plan that we think is sustainable. Again, I think one of the things that stands out with this system like the Nemasket, you have a very large amount of spawning nursery habitat. Number 2 amount in the state, Nemasket's number 1. And you also have great local stewardship working with our crew to look at all the different sites and conduct restoration at all these different sites and try to make things better for fish passage. So I think these are systems that are well managed, and I think they can support a harvest. And I do hope that the towns at least have the ability to have a harvest if we can have higher runs, because culturally this was very important. I think it also fosters stewardship when you have that. In some systems where harvest has disappeared, the stewardship does fade. Folks forget about what had been done in the past to keep these runs viable. Okay, I don't want to forget American eel, so I'm going to touch on them briefly. Herring runs were down in 2022. It was a really unusually high year for glass eels, and this was not just Massachusetts. All of the East Coast, big year of glass eels coming into our rivers. We monitored these systems. Some rivers we saw our record time in the time series this past year, so that was good. Let's see if I can get this to work. So here's one site. I can't tell you the name because I'll get in trouble. But large catches of glass eels at this site coincided with pretty good herring run there as well.
Oh, nice.
And so there's the herring run, there's the fish box. We installed great partnership with that particular town. We reconstructed the fishway a few years ago. So kind of a bright spot seeing the numbers of eels. It was ridiculous what we saw there for eels this year.
Judy's not.
She's gonna kill me. So we like to count these fish. It's what we do. We're kind of obsessed about counting, at least I am at times. So what does it all move to? Again, it can move to supporting management, like a harvest plan or stock assessment. With American eel, before this year, there was only 3 indices of abundance for American eel in New England that supported trend analyses in the stock assessment. One was the Jones River glass eel trap, and this year they accepted 2 new ones. And so these are time series that took a while to develop. The stock assessment subcommittee agreed the data would be useful. And so the Saugus River eel ramp, which was one of our first coastal eel ramps from 2007, was accepted this year as the first H1 plus eel index for New England. And then the eel bycatch in the Fall River smelt fight net was accepted as the first yellow eel index in New England. I say the first, but really New Hampshire had 2 accepted at the same time. So either way, there were no indices like this for this life stage of American eel before this year for New England. So this is what your efforts can go to. You can produce a data series that can contribute to stock assessments and other management actions. So we're pretty excited. I will point out, you probably already saw this, all those data series are trending down. And the Jones River one is significantly declining if you conduct a trend analysis. So these show geometric means with 95% confidence intervals, and they're all sloping down. Not a great scenario, I guess. So I want to finish up. I don't know how I'm doing, Abby, for time.
You have time.
Okay. I want to finish up by just putting some thoughts out there on things that are happening right now. We've had a downturn since 2019 in river herring, and it's confusing in part to me because I look at the last 75 years and I see a lot of actions that should lend towards improved herring populations. And the Clean Water Act in the mid-70s did an amazing job of reducing all that industrial pollution that at the early part of my career, I've been around too long, I guess, I used to see rivers purple, orange, North River Salem, Fall River Braintree. When the mills would discharge, the rivers would turn colors. The Clean Water Act resolved that. And so that should be a great improving influence on some of these migratory stocks. We're taking less fish. If you look at the bycatch in the 1950s and 60s for bait, the sea herring fishery, the mackerel fishery, huge bycatch in those years. That's been reduced. The spawning run harvest in coastal rivers, we take far fewer fish than we used to take in those decades. And then fishway improvements, I've separated dam removals because fishway improvements go back about 75 years and a tremendous amount of work was done. We have much better fish passage now than we had in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s when we had much higher herring run stocks. So it's interesting. So conversely, back then, much worse fish passage, much higher fish populations. Dam removals have come on the last 20 years, really important. Dam removals are popping up now, and they should contribute, but we're not seeing the benefits of, to me, this 50, 75-year dynamic that should be helping these migratory fish. I want to include this one as well. It's really case by case, but there were really big negative interactions in some locations of cranberry bogs years ago due to the fact they were competing for water. And you'd have fish kills when the juveniles were moving out. And so it was a larger issue. It should be reduced because number one, we're seeing a large reduction in just the bog production in these coastal areas. Secondly, the whole industry has learned how to minimize these interactions. So you're seeing less of these interactions. And so I think it's another factor that should result in improvements in some of these fish populations. So I'm just throwing this out there, just get some thoughts and ideas. Now, what could be dragging things down for river herring restoration? Obviously, coastal development has really increased in recent decades. I look at eutrophication as being a big problem for ponds, lakes, estuaries, coastal waters. I worry about this impact on the productivity and recruitment of early life stages of juvenile herring. Water use, really important. I think we're going to put all this together when we hear the different talks today on juvenile river herring, and I think water use is going to be a theme that comes up again and again. Climate change, we're warming. How does this impact these fish? It has to be an influence on more than just their migration patterns. And then natural mortality, we've done a great job, I think, restoring predator populations for a lot of fish and wildlife, and we haven't done quite the same job for some of their prey. And so I worry about these fish that come up to very shallow choke points. They're being exposed to really heavy predation pressures in some cases. And I said we were reducing harvest in the last slide, but I didn't want to leave fishing mortality out because I think there are still some offshore localized impacts that are possible from bycatch that could be impactful for specific populations. So I didn't want to leave that one out. Question?
Brad, what about water quality at river entrance points, estuaries, CO2 levels? I know, there's a lot of modification of the shoreline. There's a lot of boat traffic in there. Do you think the fish make decisions based on what the water quality is at the mouth of the estuary, whether they're going to go up or not? And what's that looking like?
Fascinating question. I don't know. I think that back when we had lots of industrial pollution in some of these rivers, I think fish maybe made the decision not to come into those systems. I've seen big turbidity events in construction projects basically repel fish and stop a run. But in terms of that, I don't know what's going on there. I think that, where you have good sewage treatment, your tidal waters are in pretty good shape. And so those fish are delivered to these choke points by the tidal waters. And so you would think they would come in. And then overall, we have better water quality in some of these systems because of the Clean Water Act. And so I don't know if that's a factor or not. It's an interesting question. Where I'm seeing problems is where you have limited waters like ponds, lakes, and some upper estuaries where eutrophication is causing impacts, excessive plant growth, DO swings, diurnal dissolved oxygen swings, those type of things. Larger amounts of stratification in the ponds, and so you have greater zones of anoxia and hypoxia. So those things could be a factor in the estuaries, but I think they are a factor in the ponds and
Brad, the
lakes.
second part of the question was commercial bycatch. I thought you had a plan in place to keep an eye on that, if observers on board, and then that ended a year or two ago. How are you doing with commercial bycatch as a possible source of mortality?
You might notice I left that one out. I'll take a stab at a 20-second answer. So a lot of agencies have done a ton of work to try to reduce bycatch of river herring. And there's been monitoring, there's been better dockside reporting. I think a lot has been done to try to reduce the interactions of the mackerel and sea herring fleet to catch them. However, there was a buffer zone that was put in place in federal waters to keep the fleets from fishing within 12 miles of our coast and 20 miles off the east side of Cape Cod. That was overturned in court. It was challenged by the bait industry. I thought it was a great management tool to try to reduce interactions because a lot of these river herring are caught close to the shore. And when that went in, I think last time we spoke, I probably said, yeah, that was passed. That's going to be great. It was in place for maybe 1 year. It was overturned in court. So I think that's really unfortunate. And so we'll see what happens. So I didn't want to leave that out because I still think in some locations, Block Island Sound, for example, it can still be impactful for specific runs. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to wrap up because I'm almost done, and then we'll come right back to questions. Is that a good idea, Abby?
That sounds good.
Okay. Just in case I forget. So moving on to the early life stage recruitment puzzle. So we think we have warming and eutrophication impacts on freshwater habitats as well as these marine habitats. Certainly, upper estuaries. We think we have increases in natural mortality, maybe fishing mortality. These are all concerns for early life stage recruitment. I want to zero in on reduced outflow for emigration because I think it's a theme here today. And so this is one of my last slides. And so management responses to water use impacts with juvenile herring. We're gaining a lot of great information. Meghna gave a slide on the different studies that have looked at these environmental cues, and now we're having more studies come along. So let's apply some of this knowledge we have on migration cues and then approach things case by case watershed management. The folks in the Cape are saying, we already do that. This is what we've done forever. And it's true, but I think what we need to do now more than ever is to try to document practices and maybe look for ways to document what we do for future practitioners and also try to do more to gain more water for these fish because the fish are losing ground and not much is changing in terms of the management. Stream maintenance, I think, is really important and we have to try to do it as well as we can to allow these fish to get out. And I think we have to start to look at pond level management so the ponds can be managed to allow these fish to get out when they need to. Again, this is done down the Cape already, but let's quantify it and document it. And then also get documented seasonal actions on how we do this. This won't produce water. We still have to fight for water for these fish, but I think this is something that we can do working together for this issue. So just food for thought. I want to finish on an odd note. John Shepard got a call last week about a fish kill in the basement of the motel down in Herring at the Monument River. He went down there and there was a couple thousand dead herring in the crawl space below these units here at the motel. So I went down there a few days later. We met with the owners. The crawl space in one of these units was through the floor. I went down there. I could only stay for like a minute or two because the smell of the dead fish was unbelievable. But there were thousands of dead juvenile herring in the motel. And so Ed Clark and Jimmy came down with some hydraulics and they found a crack here. The photograph doesn't show it very well, but it was an expansion joint in the concrete right next to that spillway wall. And the water was getting into the basement through there. And so the fish would back up in that auxiliary spillway and they were getting into the motel. And so we had a motel fish kill. Sounds like a cheap horror film, doesn't it? And I want to thank you all for what you folks do. There's so much work goes on to allow these fish to come in and out. Really appreciate it. Just keep it up. And here's Broad Pond in Falmouth. We stocked herring here, we put in a fishway and took out a dam to let them have access to a place they couldn't go. And we did stock only 500 fish. And you can't hear the video, but the DNR staff for Falmouth is just so excited. These are juvenile herring that resulted from that stocking, and we're coming out by the thousands. So I'll leave you that. Thank you very much.
So I am your face in front of you, but what I am sharing today is largely the work of Matt Devines. Matt is a PhD student at UMass Amherst, and he started with Connecticut Deep in the spring, which is fantastic, but it means your dissertation takes a little longer to finish. I just want to acknowledge the co-authors on the two pieces that I'll be talking about today. One is a paper that was actually published a couple of years ago, so we'll share that link to the paper with all of the stuff that comes out of this meeting. And the other is work that he is working on for his dissertation related to dam removal. And so these are all the funding sources and co-authors related to those projects. So my story here starts 10 years ago when I started with the co-op unit. And with the co-op unit, our primary collaborators are the state fish and wildlife agencies, so DMF and Mass Wildlife. And so I met with Mike Armstrong, and he knew I was a freshwater ecologist, and he knew he wasn't going to get me to go to the ocean. So he said, how about river herring? Okay, so what's the question here? What's the story? And he said, well, there are two things. One, we really want to know why there are some lakes that have so many more river herring than others. And, we've seen a lot of urbanization around here, but we see a lot of variability in lakes. We think that there's probably something with nutrients going on, but we'd really like to figure out this puzzle. And why do we want to figure out this puzzle? Because we want to figure out where we're going to put river herring back, where ones we're going to let back, and how we're going to give them access. And so today's talk is going to touch on both of these pieces. So first, we needed to go from largely the knowledge based on adult river herring to thinking about how we could collect data and learn a lot more about juvenile river herring, because they're the ones that are spending all the time in the freshwater, right? And so Matt came and presented to this group, I think it was 5 years ago now, and talked about the sampling protocol that we've developed with purse seines. And we developed this and did a couple of big sampling campaigns in 2014 and 2015. And I just highlighted the Massachusetts links here since it's a Massachusetts talk, but between those 2 years, we had 32 sites that we looked at, and we were able to look at densities and growth rates and other variables to understand the productivity from these systems and what the variability is among sites. So our sampling protocol briefly is to go out at night. So this is taken obviously not when we would be sampling. There's a little bit of light in the picture, but we do this after dark. We use a purse seine that's 4 meters deep and 30 meters long, and you can see how we kind of set it out with a trolling motor. So you set it out in a circle, then you purse the bottom, and you bring the net back literally into the boat, and then we capture all of the juvenile river herring inside there. We will do this at random locations within a lake. Matt figured out how many you need depending on your lake size. And then we go out there once a month in June, July, and August, and ultimately have a whole lot of counts of river herring within these areas, but also a lot of other information, and we take the fish back to the lab to extract the otoliths and age them. While we are out there, we do some water quality sampling. This is always just prior to our fishing, so at dusk we'll do a vertical profile with a YSI and get parameters like temperature and dissolved oxygen and conductivity. We'll do a Secchi depth, we'll do nitrogen and phosphorus. We'll collect nitrogen and phosphorus samples and chlorophyll A and dissolved organic carbon. So I'm going to jump right to the results on the density side. This is from, again, a paper that we call Feeling the Squeeze, and so we'll tell you what the Feeling the Squeeze is in a couple of slides, but First, I want to show you that we found across, here we're just plotting 29 of the 32 sites. So large variability in our river herring densities among the lakes. What you've got plotted here is a median, and then 50% confidence intervals are the boxes, and then the highs and the lows are the whiskers. And the numbers on top are of the number of hauls that we did. And so we focused here just on June and July because those are the months that we find the highest densities. And so those are, basically we're thinking about this as what's the peak, what's the possible in each of these lakes. And as we mentioned, a couple of them were across multiple years. You'll see some locations had very few samples, like that first one, only 3. We went out once and just for those 3 samples, but then some, like you see, 48 in there. So a wide range and a lot of variability. But overall, between 0.03 and 25 individual fish per cubic meter. So the big question is, what causes this variability across sites? I hope the first thing that pops into your head are adults, right? And that's the question that has come up in 2 talks already. It's like, how many juveniles do you get out of how many adults? Well, Matt was able to give us a number through this. This is a generalized additive model. We knew it wasn't a linear relationship, and it actually peaks off. So adult density does explain a large portion of that juvenile density, to the point that we can now, if we do do sampling this way with juveniles, we can estimate how many adults came in, or if you know how many adults are coming into your system from these counts, we can estimate how many juveniles there are. One of the so as we expect, the more adults, the more juveniles, but you'll see it levels out. It peaks at about 1,000 fish per hectare, and then you see a whole lot of variability there. And to us, this is one of the really interesting pieces, right? It's like, yeah, more fish will yield more juveniles to a point. And what is that to a point? And so we looked at physical characteristics, so how much habitat is there available, food resources, water quality, and those sorts of things to see what explains essentially that variability and why it peaks out there. And so in terms of physical habitat, the main driver is this adult density, the main driver of juveniles. But after that, we saw a relationship with thermocline. And so if there is a larger thermocline depth, that to us indicates more available habitat for those juveniles. And in fact, we see higher juvenile densities where there's a larger thermocline depth. Now, you might have also thought, if you're thinking habitat area, right, you think, oh, well, we'll just measure the area of the lake. Well, surface area actually wasn't that important, and neither was mean depth. And we think that's really because the fish are really limited to this upper epidymnion where it isn't really low in dissolved oxygen. And so talking about all of these plants and harvesting, that certainly is a problem in a lot of our lakes and ponds, that we have hypoxia in a lot of them, and so the fish are only able to go down so far. Particularly challenging when your food, the zooplankton, can go down farther than that, and so that seems to be a limit to the densities of juveniles that we see. In terms of water quality, the variables that we found most important were date. So we know that, right, is that depending on when you come, where that peak is of juvenile river herring. But there's an interaction between date and dissolved organic carbon. So dissolved organic carbon is what you'll see is how murky the water is, how much brown it is, how much that light penetrates in. And so if there's a lot of dissolved organic carbon, it's not penetrating in, it's also indicating this small area, and again, where the thermocline will be pretty high up, and so there isn't a lot of habitat for those juvenile river herring. And so overall, the paper, again, I said this is called Feeling the Squeeze. We really see that these juvenile densities are first and foremost driven by adults, and if we want more river herring, certainly we need to make sure that there is adult passage in there. But beyond that, it's important really to understand and manage these thermocline depths. So the greater the thermocline depth, the lower the dissolved organic carbon, the higher the amounts of juvenile river herring that habitat can support. So we can think about this from a management perspective. Again, we think about fish passage, and that's where I'm going to go to next. but also about restoration in terms of the water quality. And if we are going to think about where we want to do restoration, maybe we want to think about sites that have good, well-balanced lakes, that have large thermocline depths, that have a lot of area for river herring, because those will ultimately likely be the sites that have more potential for higher densities. So the other aspect of restoration that we've been talking about this morning, or we talked about this morning, was fish passage and dam removal. Certainly dam removal is one of the leading management strategies we have for restoring river herring, and that's why it's so exciting to hear about as many dam removals that have happened and are continuing to happen. Here's an example of Hunter's Pond that was removed in 2017. But the context, and again, the pretext that we've heard is that it's complicated and it's not easy to restore every location. Getting a willing dam owner is an important start, a lot of fundraising. River herring seem to be a great reason and for getting funding sources, but we haven't been able to restore everywhere. And so we need to have a little bit more information now about what the potential is following restoration. Somebody asked earlier this morning, so well, if you remove the dam, do they actually come back? Well, there actually have been some studies about this, and we do see that river herring colonize pretty quickly after opening habitat due to fish passage ways and dam removals. But it seemed like there was a need to do a little bit more work with this in Massachusetts, given all of these small dam removals that were happening. And so that's where we set out with largely funding from the Nature Conservancy and Allison Roy and also from DMF. And so our study sites for this project were 4 restored sites. So we have all the ones that Brad talked about. Robbins Pond that had a dam removal, Sebacia, and Winnicott upstream of Sebacia, and then Horn Pond, which is the uppermost in the Mystic River watershed. So we had all of these sites that had this restoration happening in 2017, and we monitored all of them from 2018 to 2021. At the same time, we were monitoring sites that are we call our long-term monitoring sites, but sites that we've been monitoring for many years that have had passage through that whole period of time, and so that we can try to tease apart the interannual variability associated with river herring and then what is coming back related to those dam removals. And so our questions were, how do density and growth change through time, and how does that timing and colonization oh shoot, sorry, I didn't write that question very well. So we have a couple of systems that have ponds downstream and upstream, and so how does that extent of colonization and timing change with those paired pond systems? So here are the systems that Brad introduced us to. The first is the Mill River watershed, where there were 3 dam removals over a series of a few years, and 1 fishway reconstruction, ultimately leaving both Lake Sebacia and Winnicott as suitable habitat for potential habitat for river herring. We actually didn't know if the river herring would make it up the Snake River to the Winnicott, and so we're very pleasantly surprised when they did. Another one in the Taunton system on the Setauket River, the Cotton Gin Dam, and that gave access to Robbins Pond. It currently doesn't give access to anything above that, but that was important habitat that was opened up. And then in the Mystic River system, so we had been sampling the Mystic River back in 2014, and that was following the fish ladder and the access, but then additional restorations happened, fish ladder restorations happened, and in particular, Horn Pond was just opened in 2018 from restoration that happened in 2017. And so we were looking again at those 4 years afterwards. So here's the story in a few different figures. So here's Winnicott Pond. So what we've got plotted are the 3 months, June, July, and August. So June is the black one that's probably most visible in the back, and then July and August are white and light gray, and the 4 years across the bottom, and we're just plotting the mean juvenile density. And so I guess the first piece was they came back at all of our sites. So when you remove a dam, they will return, which is great and important news and really supports what previously had been shown. And that it increases through time. 2020 is a giant asterisk in everybody's world. So we did not get approval from the university to get out and sample in June or July. So that's just an August sampling, which is why you don't see the peak there. In Sebacia, we also saw much higher numbers in 2021 compared to the previous year. So they came back in 2018, but then they kind of, if you look through there, they increased. 2019 was a low year. In Horn Pond, we saw them come with great numbers right away and using Horn Pond. And you see a lot of variability from year to year. And mostly with Horn Pond, the highest density month is June, but you see a little bit, high numbers in July and 2018 as well. And then in Robbins Pond, a small but mighty group of fish did return. This pond was actually stocked back in 2014, so there was some, kind of impetus for them coming back, and they came back right away, but we didn't do sampling in 2021, so that's why you're missing that one bar there. So I mentioned that we've got this upstream downstream situation, and we can use these same figures to look at how they're kind of using those habitats upstream and downstream. So if we first just focus on the Winnacunnet Sebacia comparison, so Winnacunnet is again more upstream than Sebacia, and interestingly, it looks like they are pushing up all the way to Winnacunnet. So I don't know what river herring think, but I like to think that they're just going to keep going until they can't go any farther. And if that habitat is good, then good for them. And so it seems like that's the case in this system. In the Horn, I'm going to take away Robbins and put down below the Upper Mystic. And so if I compare the Horn, which is upstream, and the Upper Mystic, which is below, one of the things you'll notice really quickly is that in June, they're in Horn, but not in Upper Mystic. So again, it seems like the first bout of fish are going all the way up as far as they can go and recolonizing Horn Pond. We're seeing that that's a pretty good habitat, although there's variability among years. So it's great to talk about all these densities, but we need to put it in context. So all of our other control sites are in this figure as well. So we basically put an average of all of, so each of the 4 years are a different bar right now. And so everything with an asterisk are our restored sites. So of the 5 most right sites that have the lowest bars, 4 of the 5 are our restored sites. So they came back, but they're not nearly to the densities that we know of some of the awesome systems we have in Great Herring Pond and Upper Mystic and Whitman's. And then Chebeco is another one of that's actually a low density control site up in the northern part of the state. So, so we found that was interesting that yes, we found this recovery, but they have a long ways to go into getting really high densities. And given those patterns of increasing, we do think that probably if somebody was trying to see full recovery, you would have to look a lot longer than 4 years to figure that out. But one of the other interesting observations we had were the size differences in the fish. And so here are plots of the length frequencies in all of these different ponds with our control sites up top. So again, these are ordered from the highest densities to the lowest densities. And so you see a whole bunch more fish on these, but if you look left to right, you'll see that as we come down here, you see more kind of larger. So these are the larger on the right-hand side, total length. So we were seeing that in some of our restoration sites, we're seeing large ranges of sizes of fish. And the question becomes, well, are they all spawned at different times? Is that why we're seeing a big range, or are there differences in growth rates? And so we extracted otoliths of these fishes that we brought back into the lab and aged them and calculated growth rates. And this is actually one of our most interesting, I think, and exciting results, is the growth rates for all of these restored sites noted the densities were the highest on the left for the control sites, and now all of our restored sites are on the left because they have the highest growth rates. I've put a one line there so you can see that a little better, and you can see that the sites, all of the sites with the highest growth rates are all of our restored sites. With the exception of Chebeco, so that's also a site that has a low density of river herring and really high density, the high growth rates. So they come back and nothing's been eating them for a while. Nothing's been eating the zooplankton for a while and they get really fat. That's our story. And so the good question is, so what does that mean? What does that mean for their productivity? What does that mean for, 3-4 years ago when those fish come back? Are they going to produce even more? Are these surviving better because they are growing to large sizes? And we don't have the answers to all of those questions, but it is important to know that they come in, they're low density systems, but they grow fast, and so that's a good sign, I think, for dam removal being successful. And why do they grow fast? Well, of course, first because that there are low densities, which I just mentioned. So here's a relationship between juvenile growth and density. And so if you have more juveniles, you have lower growth rates. And we've seen this across our many of our sites that we've monitored for the last 8 years. And then we also see a relationship with, as I mentioned, the zooplankton. So there's a strong relationship, increasing relationship between juvenile growth and zooplankton biomass. So it seems like prey availability is a big part of that, that this is a typical, what we call an ecology density dependent scenario where you get density so high that it reduces the food and it reduces the growth. So that is another piece of Matt's work actually from his master's that he's working on getting out right now. Okay, so I think this dam removal piece is a lot about just figuring out what do we expect and what should we expect from all these new dam removals that are coming online. And so I think one thing that you should expect if you're one of these places that have one is that you should see river herring and they should come back right away that next year. And if you don't, I hope that's not the case because they should immediately come back. There are enough fish from neighboring streams and rivers to be able to colonize. That they will grow really fast when they get into these habitats because they have a food supply that's large and not a lot of competition. And that most likely it will take more than 4 years to get this recovery. And we're not following it longer, but that would be interesting to know how many years until you get to sort of a run stabilization factor. I want to make a point too, though, that this is it's all in the numbers. So probably a single small dam removal is not going to recover all of our river herring in Massachusetts, and that's why it's exciting that we're seeing a whole lot happen, and we're seeing what Brad was calling these sort of large watershed restorations, because doing a lot in one watershed is really what would be important for bringing river herring back in that watershed, in that system. So I just want to end with a sort of vision. I do a lot more than river herring work, and I've actually been working on dam removal for many years and trying to understand the ecological responses to dam removal in terms of water quality and benthic macroinvertebrates and fishes, and including inland fishes. And been having a lot of conversations about how we prioritize to really restore watersheds. And a lot of what we're doing right now is very opportunistic. We get a dam owner that, they're a willing dam owner, and that's where we go. It's not a bad thing. That's how we get these started, right? But potentially, if we're more strategic about where we remove dams based on priorities, then we can restore watersheds a little more efficiently. The Division of Ecological Restoration has this restoration potential tool that helps to rank their sites based on a variety of things, including connectivity, thermal refuge, and coastal are part of it. Now with DMF's tool, I think the combination of these can help think a little more holistically about where would be the best location. We also need to think I'm sorry to say this to a river herring crew, but not just about river herring. And I hope actually the beginning of the talk it drove that home, right? The story there was there is this thermocline issue in DOC and there's a water quality issue, right, that limits river herring. And so we can't, if we just put on the blinders and say, we just wanna give access, right, connectivity, then we're not going to get as far as we will get if we think holistically about watershed restoration, about water quality, stormwater management, et cetera. And that means thinking in the whole watershed, not just the first dams from the coast, but all the way up and throughout the watershed. So that's my soapbox. And with that, I will end, and I'm happy to entertain questions by time now. But also, I left my emails up there and Matt's email, so feel free to contact either of us directly.
We actually had fish staging, getting ready to leave where the stream should be, and they couldn't get out. And so, again, it sort of got me thinking, well, we know at this point that some amount of seawater specialization occurs before migration, right? I showed you those physiological findings, and those are just a few of, there are more of them. But we don't know the consequence of staying in fresh water when those fish are ready to migrate. So again, we kind of talked before about how do adult alewife or river herring give us babies, but now I'm asking, well, how do the juveniles grow into adults? How do they give us a successful population based on what they experience as young? And so I had to consider both drought and density because, as we've discussed, density in the pond is going to really affect their experience if they're trapped in it. So if they're trapped in with only a couple of their cohort, it's probably not going to have as much of an effect on resource availability as if they're stuck in there for a very long time with a lot of their siblings. So these were sort of the two main stressors that I was focusing on in these modeling efforts. And what I have here are run data, and again, these correlate to the young of the year that are going to be deposited into these pond systems. So I predicted that with an increase in drought and or adult run size, which would correlate to how many fish are in the pond, I would expect a decrease in the juvenile size, a decrease in the iteroparity, which is repeat spawning, and an increase in adult size, age, and iteroparity would be predictors of better year class strength. So that kind of boils down to, well, if juveniles have good experiences as young, then they'll be really strong adults, and their siblings will also be really strong adults. But then there's the other side of the coin. So to do this, I collected a whole suite of data on Bride Lake and, again, East Lyme, Connecticut. It's down on the coast of Connecticut, kind of central region. And this has been a long studied site, so I had a whole wealth of samples and information on it that I could use. I was really lucky. So I worked with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. They gave me scale samples from 2009 to 2020, which then I have to do some like mathematical magic and figure out when fish were born based on aging and what birth years and year classes we have. So that's why those numbers are up there, just in case you could reference them. But I pulled from public records the number of fish migrating into that pond because they have a fish counter there. And then scales, again, that the state had collected, and they had collected both size and sex of the adult that those scales came from. And then we could use those scales to get the birth year of that fish as well as spawning records. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with aging river herring scales, but this is sort of what I look like. I call this the reader's schematic. On one side, you see an image of an actual scale, and on the other, you see what a trained alewife scale reader would see. So those rings that you see, they're sort of rings with tops, are year lines. So this is a 5-year-old fish because we count the edge. You can count 4 dotted lines, and then the edge of the scale is year 5. And these sort of squiggly lines there are actually spawning marks. So what happens is when a fish swims upstream to spawn, it reabsorbs some of its scales because it's the freshwater environment is nutrient deficient compared to the saltwater environment. And then once they head back out to sea, their scales start to regrow, and it leaves this really jagged line. So we can actually tell the spawning history of a fish just based on its scale. We can also, I didn't include this in the talk, but I can also back calculate size at any given age based on the distance from that baseline of the scale to each of the peaks of those rings because we had the adult length of the fish. So scales actually are a huge wealth of data. That's what drew me to them, and they're, in my opinion, they're underutilized as a really non-invasive way of getting a lot of information. Now, that said, otoliths can be a little bit more accurate, but when you have a huge data set like we had here, that margin of error shrinks and your uncertainty shrinks, which is great. Great for a PhD student, you can spend 6 years on it. So I also collected water availability data, because again, we're talking about drought here. Drought data is very complex. I had different scales of data from daily to weekly and so on and so forth. So I sort of collated all this data on Connecticut drought, and I boiled it down to 2 indicator variables that squashed the dimensionality of the drought variability into 2 summary statistics. I used a principal component analysis to do that. And so my summary statistics boiled down to an early drought statistic and a late drought statistic. So droughts that are happening around mid-May, and then droughts that are happening in late October, early November. Again, both of those dates being sort of important for ALEWIFE migrations. I took all that data and I ran a bunch of Bayesian models to see what predictors were important. I can dive in a little bit more to that if you have questions, but I'm going to leave it at that for today's talk just for sake of time. But I'll tell you what I found in terms of river hang and drought. So it turns out that there are significant predictors of juvenile growth and adult spawning. We'll look at growth first. So the figure on your left, you can see length at age 1 is on that vertical axis. On the bottom is a drought. The numbers aren't super important here. Just remember that this is late season drought, and the negative numbers on the left is very little drought, and as you move to the right, you're getting worse. Drought is getting bad all the way to the right. Higher numbers are bad. Okay. So length at age 1 is much smaller at high drought numbers. Okay, that sort of makes sense, right? We're experiencing this environmental stressor, so maybe growth rates aren't going to be so good. Then if we look at adult spawning, and yes, these figures will get a little bit complicated, but I promise I'm going to walk you through them. If we look at adult spawning and number of iterations, you can see here on that axis it's 1, 2, and 3. So it's the number of repeat spawns that fish never repeat spawn, maybe it repeat spawned once. We actually had fish that repeat spawned 4 times, or 4 times total, repeat 3 times. And we see that when we have, for early season drought, so we have multiple lines here because there's an interaction. So when we have high early season drought, which is in red, but low late season drought, which is on the left-hand side of this, we have high iteraparity. On the flip side, if we have very low early season drought, very high late season drought, we also have high iteraparity. So what that boils down to, stay with me, is that if we only have one kind of drought, then we can respond by spawning multiple times. Okay? All right, we've been impacted, no big deal, I'll just spawn again, right? If we have both kinds of drought, if we, all the way in that bottom corner, that bottom far corner where it says 312, and it's a red line, we have almost no repeat spawning there. So if you get a drought that lasts most of the summer, or you have a periodic drought in May and a periodic drought in October, kind of like what we're experiencing this year, turns out they can't be as resilient to that as they can if they only experience one type of drought. Okay, so what we're looking at here from this figure is really a measure of resiliency of the population to disturbance. And interestingly, if there's no drought, we also don't see a lot of iteraparity, which may indicate that iteraparity is a response to intermediate disturbance. So this sort of challenges, and some of the other findings from this chapter challenge our traditional view that older fish and repeat spawners are pillars of really healthy river herring communities. What this study actually found was that the intermediate populations, ones that experience some amount of perturbance but not too much, are actually the ones that are the oldest, that grow the biggest, that actually repeat spawn the most. It's kind of like a tough love situation. All right, and then the last big data slide is now we look at year class strength. So we looked at on the individual scale before what's going on, but now let's ask, what if we took a whole population and we looked at it holistically? How are they doing in response to drought? And so I'll show you what they actually look like. My advisor at the time called these the spaghetti monsters, so I said, okay, we'll make them simpler. So now we only have 3 year classes. We have a weak, an intermediate, and a strong, just so we can kind of see that spectrum. And we'll start on the left here and look at age at first spawn. So in our weak year classes, our age at first spawn is very young. I think we've seen that in a lot of cases. When you have a highly impacted river herring run, they tend to only grow to, like, you have a lot of 2-year-olds, a lot of 3-year-olds, especially maybe 4-year-olds, right? And again, we tend to think of these really strong populations and what we're seeing here as having older fish, 6-year-olds, even 7 and 8-year-olds in some cases. What's interesting about this figure is that this is age at first spawn. So what this is saying is that in the strongest year classes, the year classes that have the most fish, the healthiest fish in them, they actually wait to spawn until they're 6 years old. They're not spawning at 4 and then coming back at 5 and 6. They're just waiting.
Wow.
Right? And it's very interesting. This was a shocker to me. And it happened right at the end of my PhD. So then if we move to length at first spawn, we see with our weak year class that we have the smallest fish at first spawn. Again, this makes sense. But our largest fish actually occur, again, at the intermediate strength. So they're almost like responding to perturbance in this way that they feel like they need to be more robust in some way. The population responds by becoming more robust. And again, we see the same thing with interparity. We get the most interparity, the most frequency of repeat spawning in these intermediate strength year classes. Okay, I told you that I was done with data. We're done with the data. But I just want to leave you with a couple take-home messages, which is when we look at fish, and this is a theoretical framework that I developed for my PhD, when we look at fish that are diadromous, that migrate for reproductive purposes, and especially those that need to move between different salinity environments, that's a really high energetic cost, right, to do that. And they're doing it because they can gain access to resources that other fishes can't gain access to. But they depend on having high environmental predictability, right, to be able to have this sort of lifestyle. The problem that we're facing with drought is that now drought is pushing us into an area where, on this figure, where environmental conditions are no longer as predictable as they used to be in terms of when these fish can leave the pond, when they can get into the pond, how nicely they can leave the pond. And it could push us into a place where diadrome becomes unsustainable in some locations. And I think that's why it's really important that we're having these types of discussions today to manage our water resources and make sure that we don't get pushed into that farther quadrant. So, while some of these fish get tons of, attention, like salmon, because, and this is sort of like one of the ideas behind my PhD, is why I like to show this image, is that salmon historically have gotten a lot of attention because they're so charismatic with their migratory changes. We have to protect these guys too. So with that, I know I covered a lot of ground today. I will be giving a more in-depth talk on my drought data and findings at the Fisheries meeting in January. If anyone is going to be there, you can find my talk in the schedule there, or I'm happy to answer questions now, of course, but also to talk offline later on about any of this. So thank you so much for having me.